everyone, Patricia Warby, Alchemy Therapies here, and I'm going to be doing something a little different today. I normally do book reviews, discussions with colleagues about topics of interest in the subject of emotional healing. But today I was spurred on actually by an article I read in the Observer newspaper. It's actually an old article. I've discovered it by mistake or sort of accident from the 14th of November 2021. And it was a book interview with an author, Tim Snyder, I think his name is, Timothy Snyder with a Y, about a book he wrote called On Tyranny. And it really struck me because it's been reissued in the light of the events of 2020 and 2021, you know, the pandemic, because he brought it out, I think it was in 2017, and I have a copy here. It's called On Tyranny, and it was in the wake of Trump's, inauguration and the fact that he came to power. And really the premise of the book is that there are 20 lessons we need to learn from the 20th century, what happened in the previous century, during some of the regimes that sought to provide simple answers to global problems and created tyrants who were in power and would give you a nice, easy answer, which was then adopted by various populations. We saw it in Germany, for instance, and of course in the Soviet Union, and that's very relevant now. So it's never been a better time, I think, to look at some of the lessons from history. And I was going to do a review of the whole book because it's a very, very small book, the original one. The reprint has apparently got illustrations in. This is just text. I'd love to get a copy of the reprint, it would be amazing. But it's a very thin book, but it's a very important book. It's a very dense, there's lots of information in here that you ponder. You can kind of sit down with it and meditate on some of the lessons, actually. And so what I've decided to do is to actually take a chapter per video, and I'm going to just make them short and to the point rather than trying to gloss over the entire book in some way, because it's got such an important message and I don't want to do that. So 20 lessons, 20 chapters. I'm going to look at the prologue today, so there'll be 21 videos, I imagine, if all goes to plan. I just want to read you some of this because it is extraordinary. History does not repeat, but it does instruct. Now, he's talking particularly in the light of the American Constitution and how that was founded by the founding fathers and the lessons they took from Greek history, particularly, is they wanted to establish a democracy where all people were equal. It's in the Constitution. They wanted to avoid tyranny, which is the evil of one person taking over and forcing a population to behave in certain ways and believe in certain ways, because you can't create behavior without instilling beliefs, as we've seen recently in Russia. So this is a slightly American viewpoint, but of course it's very relevant to all Western nations, really. And I think where he's talking about the bad news is that the history of modern democracy is also one of decline and fall. So we go through cycles of, if in my own lifetime, the 50s and 60s, that's not in my lifetime actually, but just prior to my lifetime, we were in a period of contraction in some places. In America, it was very much, the dictatorial idea that communists were under the bed, and you had to have these ways of finding them and exposing them, and people were taught to expose their friends and shop their friends, and that was the McCarthyist era. In the UK, we had the sort of post-war kind of optimism where we were founding a lot of our the health service was founded, for instance, in the 50s. So it's it's a very interesting thing that you kind of have this cycle that goes up and down. And in the 70s, I remember the 70s was a period of optimism, expansion, you know, we'd never had it so good kind of thing, until the end of the 70s, when in the UK we had Margaret Thatcher, and in the US they had Ronald Reagan, and the ideas reversed, and we were back into, well, we were into an idea of expansion in money terms, but in terms of socially and coming together as community, not at all. Margaret Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as community. And she basically, she expounded that view, and she made sure that legislation followed that. So we have this cycle going on, which we need to kind of be aware of. Nothing stays the same. We need to learn from what has happened before and apply some of the principles, and that's what this book is really about. And it's talking really that ordinary people were the ones that kind of established, for instance, the Nazi regime, because you got people actually following orders because they believed it was a moral duty, and that's how it was put to them, that you would want to get rid of one particular group of people who were considered vermin. That's how they were described, and it was ordinary people that began to adopt these beliefs because that's what they were hearing, and doing extraordinary things. So it isn't just the idea of an evil leadership, it's the way that that can change human behavior in the population, and I think that's very relevant for today, really. So we're seeing, you know, we had 5 decades of the Soviet Union, and we had, you know, 2 or 3 of the European dictators as well. So it happened between the era of the 1920s right up until sort of the 1970s, early 1980s. The Soviet Union was, you know, collapsed. But it's very interesting, he says in the this opening preface, is that both fascism and communism were responses to globalization. Globalization, you know, the idea that we're in a global market, a global world that has no checks and balances. It's just whatever's cheapest, and you will produce whatever you need, wherever you need, and import it, and that there is no local accountability. And so it's actually a result of inequality. Inequality really drives a lot of this. And the apparent helplessness of the democracies in addressing this inequality. And we're seeing this again, aren't we? In fact, I think inequality is probably one of the initial ideas that was adopted from the Greeks by the founding fathers, that even Aristotle, you see, knew that inequality brought instability. It brings unstable, you know, an arena that's unstable, because basically people get dissatisfied and they get comparisons with other people that have more than them. And so we see that the most equal societies, for instance, you know, Sweden is a good example, where the highest earners and the lowest earners isn't a great multiple, compared to, say, America or even the UK now, I would say, where the highest earners earn vast amounts more. You know, it's no longer 5 or 6 times more, it's something like 20 or 30 times more than the lowest earners. So inequality drives this, because it drives certain human behaviors that seek to social climb, that want to achieve, but which is nothing wrong with achievement, but at the expense of each other. You know, this climb over the bodies of other people, because we are being driven to kind of feel that we're in a sense of scarcity and we haven't got enough and we need more. And it just drives more and more consumerism, as I've talked about before. And so fascism and communism, although they seem worlds apart, are both extreme responses to globalization, this sense of inequality. And now fascists, of course, rejected the kind of democracy in the name of a sort of a will of the people, or a divine right, if you like. Communists were slightly more pragmatic, but they were ruled by a disciplined party elite who claimed the monopoly on reason. You know, we know, you don't. That would guide society towards this envisioned ideal. You know, the workers uniting to create goods, and but the reality was that many people, thousands, millions of people starved because not the will of the people wasn't really enough, and it didn't actually create the ability to create the goods or to run the farms. You know, just having the will is not enough, as we know. You actually need to know what you're doing. And some people are good at some things and some people are not. And I think understanding human nature in that is really important. And here's a very important summary, is that we might be tempted to think that our democratic heritage automatically protects us from such threats, the kinds of threats that we saw in the early part of the 20th century. This is a misguided reflex. Our own tradition demands that we examine history to understand the deep sources of tyranny and to consider the proper responses to it. We are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism in the 20th century. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience. Now is a good time to do so. And I think, you know, if you understand that societies can break, democracies can fail, and ethics can collapse, and ordinary men and women can find themselves standing over death pits with guns in their hands, this is a direct quote, it would serve us well both today to understand why. And really, that's something I want to explore because ethics is very important. Ethics they're not something I primarily deal with. I tend to deal more with values when I'm working with people. What are your individual values? Because we all have them. But ethics is more, I think, the values of a society. And we do belong in societies. I mean, we do exist in societies, and they should nurture us. They should support us, and they should be responsive to collective feelings, to collective ideas. But of course, democracy relies on that, but it's been very much superseded recently with censorship, with shutdown, with closure of debate. And I find that a really worrying trend. And so I hope you'll join me in reviewing each chapter, and I will post obviously links in the description below, but just want to end with one thing. One of the big problems at the moment is that we find it hard to imagine a viable future. Art and literature enable us to flex those imaginative muscles. So what he's saying is that creativity could be the opposite, if you like, to tyranny. Not necessarily freedom. Freedom is a really important value, and it's one of my top values, which is why I think probably I'm very resistant to what's going on. But creativity is the most important antidote, really, because you can exercise creativity, but only when you feel safe. And the problem is, as I've spoken before, is that most of us aren't feeling safe in our environment at the moment. We're not feeling safe in our communities, in our nations, or in our world. We've been extremely threatened by events of the last decades, the last few decades, really most of my life, this has been creeping in. And when we are in fight and flight, when we are under threat, we cannot think creatively. And we surely need to do that now. We need to get into creative thought expression. And so I hope my little contribution to this will be reading aspects from this book and discussing what I feel about them, and hopefully enabling you to contribute as well. So let's get optimistic or hopeful and create something new. Thanks for listening. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.